This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Hello, welcome to this week edition of African Drums. I'm David Hinds, sitting in for LC, our regular host. It's Emancipation season. Elsie Harry is the name I'm reminded here. It's Emancipation season, and this is the time when African Guyanese take time out to reflect on their history, their heritage, their present condition, where they've been, where they're going. It's also a time when other Guyanese join with African Guyanese to reflect on Guyana as a whole. Here in the African Drums, we have been focusing on the African Guyanese condition over the last 6 months or so. Today we want to start a series on African Guyanese history. It's often said that African Guyanese history began when they arrived on the shores of what we call Guyana today. However, that's not true, because they were people, they had a culture, they had a history before they came to the Americas. Walter Rodney, in his work on the history of the Upper Guinea coast, also his seminal work on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, expanded on that issue, the issue that African Guyanese did have a culture before they arrived there. We want to talk about that today, and with me in the studio is Dr. Norman Ng-A-Qui. He is a former engineering professor and a member of Cuffy 250, and someone I would refer to as our in-house historian. He is somewhat of an expert on what they usually call ancient African history. Dr. Ng-A-Qui, welcome. I want you first of all to nail that concept of ancient African history.
All right. It's a pleasure to be here, David. Now, ancient, when we look at ancient in today's world, as Africans have the only right to say ancient, because Africans have the history that begins with time zero. In other words, when human beings first appeared on the planet, they appeared in Africa, and that is about 230,000 years ago, right? So when we look at ancient African history, we're looking at 230,000 years to around the time of the Egyptian civilization. All right. Now, Africans have the only right to say ancient African in that context. Now, if you look past time zero, I'm looking at 0 CE, Common Era. I consider that more modern times, from the times of the Greeks moving forward. All right. Now, if you look at 230,000 BC to now, if you break that into 2 general periods, and for our convenience here, we'd like to call it 230,000 to 711 AD or CE, Common Era. All right. Now, why is that 711 important? Because that is a time when we have more of the influence that has impacted what's called Western civilization. All right. Now, step back a little bit to the times when the Egyptian civilization ended. All right. Then you had the Egyptians civilizing the Greeks, and that's what caused the Greeks to move forward. And then the Greeks, after that, the other period in history was when the Moors civilized the Spanish and the Portuguese, which is in the Iberian Peninsula now. And that's around the 711. This is the 711 period that we're talking about. what people, why that's important to us now is, oftentimes we do not put together the fact that at the time that Africans had great civilizations, Europeans had no civilization at all. And why 7/11 is important, because that is when the Moors moved into Spain and Portugal and brought civilization to them. And this is over a period of 781 years, right? And then at the end of that period, we were at 1492. Now, if you look at 1492, then 1492 is when the Spanish, when the Portuguese really started to use what they learned from the Moors, right, to devastate the world.
Right. And 1492, of course, is the year that Mr. Columbus
yes,
lied about
that is
discovering the Americas.
But that is roughly the time when, if people don't want to look beyond that, looking back, because when they look back, all they see is the Moors, who are black people from North Africa, civilizing the Portuguese and the Spanish. And people would like to think that that's where you have the great civilization, and then from there you have the Europeans,
the beginning of history.
Beginning of history.
Right, as someone recently said, the end of history.
Right.
You know, the way in which people order history. But Dr. Ng-A-Qui, let me you use the word civilization,
Well,
and Walter Rodney, who we're going to draw on in this series, Walter Rodney took objection to the use of the word civilization. Explain that. Right?
Seriously, because civilized implies some sort of empathy for your fellow human beings. Right? What the Europeans did after they got culture, they got knowledge, they got science, technology, and so forth from the Moors. What they did is set out on a rampage to literally, well, what they did with the indigenous people all over the world is historical now. They literally committed genocide all wherever they found indigenous people. That, Walter Rodney says, you know, based on what was done to other human beings, is not considered civilizing. That's not civil. That is totally uncivil, if you will. So he said, what you need to do is not use the word civilization, but talk about cultures.
Yes. In case you're just joining us, this is the African Drums. I am David Hinds, sitting in for L.C. Harry, and you have heard Walter Rodney. He is one of the foremost historians of the last 75 years or so. He is a Guyanese, of course. He has written two very important books on Africa, the history of the Upper Guinea coast, and how Europe underdeveloped Africa. You young people in the audience, if you get a chance, get hold of those two books, because they are extremely important. They are what I would say Guyana's contribution to the world, because Rodney is from here. Ivan van Sertima, they came before Columbus, making the case that black people were here in the Americas long before Mr. Columbus came here. And they're now unearthing evidence that in Guyana, black people were even here before the Caribs. Very interesting information is coming out. Let's move to West Africa, Norman, because that's where our ancestors, for the most part, came from. We've heard about the great African cultures of that period, Mali, Songhai, etc., etc. Talk about those cultures and how they were able to shape those people who were then captured and brought here.
Okay, all right. The very first of the great civilizations, the great West African civilizations, was Ghana. All right. And that was not in the location that Ghana is right now. That is more central. Right? It is closer to where Mali is now. Right? So you had the Ghana kingdom. Then that was followed or overlapped with the Mali, the Kingdom of Mali, and then that overlapped with the Songhai.
Yeah.
All right. Now, further to the south, you had other kingdoms. You had Benin, you had the Mossi, right, and that's in now Burkina Faso, right, and Benin is roughly where Benin is now. But those are, again, all African civilizations, all, we want to call them civilizations, we want to call
cultures.
them cultures, all right. And this is culture in the true sense of the word. And now a little bit about the accomplishments, right. Let's start with Ghana. Ghana has the Kingdom of Ghana. The first universities that we know of is Timbuktu. That is right in the center of Ghana. This turned later on became part of Mali, which became part of the Songhai kingdoms. Now, at the time that university was, and this is in way before Oxford, Cambridge, and these places.
The first university in the human experience
right,
in Africa, in Timbuktu,
and
black people, African people.
Right. You know, there was a time when growing up, you say, how far you want to go? You say, well, boy, you're going to Timbuktu.
Right.
They used to use that in a derogatory sense. Well, as usual, you must look in the opposite direction. That was the seat of knowledge, that was the seat of education, that was where you had thousands of manuscripts, books written at the time. All right. So Timbuktu, so education was one of the things early on that the cultures from Ghana, Mali, and Songhai encouraged and fostered. The other thing was trade. Right, trade was absolutely substantial, and this is trans-Saharan trade, not as opposed to transatlantic trade, which we'll talk about later. But the trans-Saharan trade was a major accomplishment of the cultures at that time. Now, they traded all over the world, literally all over the world. Now, what we tend to focus on trans-Saharan trade because that went roughly to the Mediterranean, and this is Eastern Mediterranean. It went all the way to India. Okay. What was not clear as history evolved is that they also had transatlantic trade. Right. Now, it was not to the extent that they have transatlantic trade during the time of the African Holocaust, but people, Africans, South Africans, North Africans did leave Africa and travel across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Thousands of years before Columbus was even a twinkle in somebody's eye.
They had to have knowledge of navigation.
Well, this is the thing. The knowledge was so extensive that when the Europeans came, they were surprised. They started to hear about these Western places where these Africans go. And this is what prompted the Europeans, at that time the Portuguese, to want to go west. Remember, the Portuguese were just educated and given culture by the Moors. The Moors were black people, so they were no strangers. It's not like the Portuguese came down the coast and said, "Oh, they're black people. Let's take them." You know.
Yeah, right.
The Moors were black people, gave civilization to the Portuguese, so they knew there was more substance there. They just came to chase the gold.
Right. The use of the camel.
The use of for transatlantic
for the trade.
Yes,
you know, right.
Yeah, let's look at the different steps. Right? When they came down the coast and they found out that they could go overseas, then they did actually. And when they got there, they found these are black people speaking Arabic, and they're doing what? What are these Indians? What do they have on the tips of their arrows? They had gold arrow tips. So the Portuguese took the gold arrow tips took them back to Portugal and Spain. When they analyzed them, it was the consistency, the alloy constituents were the same as Malian gold. As it turns out in further research, you find out that the Malians, King Abu Bakr II, had several expeditions. I mean, thousands of ships with coupled Africans, meaning males and female, went to South America. And along the coast you have all of that. Now, so you don't hear that. What you hear is the glorious European stories.
Right.
Now, but because of the wealth, and this is the other thing, the trade that existed was transatlantic, but the main thing for that period was the Trans-Sahara trade. Trans-Sahara trade was, and they were the leaders in Trans-Sahara trade because of the education, because of what they in fact were shipping. Gold, salt,
right? Yes,
right.
Very important,
right? All of the herbs, the cola nuts, things that were of value at that point in time. So the network that existed, was what made the African civilizations substantial.
And on that note, the voice of Dr. Ng-A-Qui of Cuffy 250. This is African Drums, and in case you're wondering who is this, well, I'm sitting in for LC Harry, and we want to remind you that Cuffy 250 will be holding its second annual forum on the state of Black and African Guyanese on August the 10th. August the 10th is going to be at Critchell Labour College, and the theme of the conference will be 50 years of Guyanese independence, assessing where we've been and looking at the future, planning for the future. We have a lineup of speakers that include Dr. Ng-A-Qui, who's here, Nigel Hughes, David Granger, Kyle Greenidge, Shama Solomon, Onassis Granville. I will be there to put in my little piece. So we have a wide array of speakers. And it's on the 10th. Put that on your calendar. It's on the 10th. Last year, registration went very quickly. People came and couldn't get into the conference. So we want you to start to register pretty early this year. Registration fee is $1,200. Students under 16 years, $600. Here is where you can get more information. Call 231-7088 or 231-7888. That's 231-7088 or 231-7888, or you can email us at coffee250gy at gmail.com. That's coffee250gy at gmail.com. And you know what else? You can go to Eventbrite, www.eventbrite.com, and when you get there, just type in Cuffy 250 second annual State of Black African Guyanese. If you do that, you can go and pre-register. So we're asking you to register early. Tell others who might not be aware that the forum is on again this year. Remember last year we had the first forum. We had over 400 African Guyanese and others there, and we had a very, very, very productive discussion which led to a year of activity on the part of the Cuffy 250. We've been working in the communities on the West Coast, on the West Bank. We've had several forums. We have several projects. We have emancipation camps in August coming with young people. So we took the mandate last year that we needed to go into communities and begin to work, and that's what we've been doing for the last year. So part of what we'll be doing this year is reporting on that kind of work, but also beginning a discussion on independence. We became independent in 1966, and another 2 years will be 50 years, and it's time, we think, to begin a discussion on what has been the content of that independence, where we have been, and to begin to think about what the next 50 years of independence would be. So come out to that forum, Cuffy 250 Forum on the State of African Guyanese on August 10th. It will be at the Critchlow Labour College in the heart of Georgetown. And listen out for more information as the days go by. Dr. Ng-A-Qui, you talked about trade, you talked about education. But those ancient cultures, those African cultures, West African cultures, also did something else. They created government.
Yes, yes.
Songhai, for example, which was a very large kingdom, and they were able to have regions and so on. Talk about that a little bit more.
All right. When the Europeans got to this area, they were astonished because they didn't quite understand the level of sophistication of the African community. They know about the Moors because the Moors just educated them, but they never had first-hand experience. When they got there, they found out that these communities had a constitution. They had a written constitution that established the governing rules of the society. Right. Songhai was one of the key. They had almost a congress, which they call a Gabara, of 29, representing 29 clans, which means, and these are not 5 or 10 people; these are millions of people. So they had representative governance from 1300, way before other parts of the world. Okay, when the Europeans got there, they said, "Well, wait a minute. How could this be?" And as they went further on, they went into Benin. They found this is. I mean, we've heard about the Moors and we know about the Moors, but we didn't realize that this had extended pretty much all of West Africa, because they know about the gold, they know about the trade, they know about Timbuktu now, but they didn't understand the level of sophistication. So when they started to lie and rewrite history, they had to find ways to pretend. So what you read now is that the African courts were modeled after the Europeans, right? As opposed to when they went in, they were surprised because the African courts and the African system, right, written constitutions were there before, long before these other places came into being. So as you read and you get more exposed, and Africans should understand quite clearly that not only were there the wealthiest cultures in the world. I'm talking about Mali. The king of Mali went on a pilgrimage to Mecca and took some gold, and the amount of gold that he took literally collapsed the Mecca economy. It was, where is all this wealth coming from? And that too those are some of the things that inspired the Europeans to come looking for Mali. They wanted to know where all these people come, where the people have the technology and the knowledge to travel cross country in trade with 50 tons of gold. I mean, what kind of people really do this? So governance is one of the key things, which again we're never told. We are always led to believe that that history began with the slave ships. Yes, and that's the point we're trying to stress here today, that African Guyanese did have a history before slavery, that Africans did have a history before colonization, and we are, and a substantial history. And we need to understand that. Not only wealth, we had structured cultures, not people climbing trees and on this tree and that tree. We had structured cultures. We had villages. We had places that were set up where we respected our kingship, we respected our leadership at that time. Respected. I mean, it was a serious event. Now, families played a major role in how the systems were set up, right? Because without a strong family and without your strong roots, the system couldn't stand. And I think the Europeans realized that once they started slavery. They said the first thing we have to do is to break up these people's family, make them feel like they come from nowhere, right? But the family was the key unit in African society. How this works too. If you are part of my family, and you could travel anywhere in Africa, and you could say, I'm David Hinds' cousin, and it's something that carried on into our culture here. Because remember, in the old days, somebody said, I'm David Hinds' cousin. You say, which Hinds? Right. Now, are you the Hinds from New Amsterdam or the Hinds from Buxton? Now, no, it's not the Buxton Hinds. This is the Hinds from Essequibo. Also, you related to Paula, and she is the daughter of Theodore, right? But this is not gap. This is serious linking of roots, right? Now, the Portuguese and the Europeans realized that in order to really make you slaves, you have to destroy those linkages.
Yes, destroy the family. And on that note, Dr. Ng-A-Qui, I think our time has run out and you're now warming up. But we could continue. Yes, we do have a series, and so we'll definitely have you back. Your history is important, your culture is important. It was Garvey who said, people without a history and a culture are rudderless people. And so part of what we do here on African Drums, part of what we do in Coffee 250, is to really lead a fight to reclaim that history. To reclaim that history, not to dominate others or to show off or to reminisce, but to reclaim that history as a tool of empowerment for African Guyanese, as a tool of healing between African Guyanese and other ethnic groups, so that all of Guyana can know that all of its people come from very, very strong and dignified cultures. Again, African Guyanese did have a history, black people did have a history before they were captured on the shores of Africa and brought here to the Americas. Until the next time, this is David Hinds, thanking you for tuning in to yet another edition of African Drums. And remember, our motto on this program is education, is empowerment, is self-activity, and it's consciousness. See you next time.